Well, hello, everybody. Today we're going to have Brian Decker talk to us. SharePoint Part 2, it seems like. I talked to Brian earlier today, and it's kind of interesting sometimes the backgrounds of people. He talked about a computer that he started on many years ago that I haven't heard that name for at least 15 years probably. He started work at one time on programming with a Prime computer. Have any of you ever heard of that? Okay. He also talked about PDP-11s. If you remember, that was one of those things I camped on many years ago. He probably saw them later, and they're probably old, and in my case, they were brand new and nifty things. In any case, Brian is from Springfield originally, so I can't say, well, why'd you come here? He started here, and for a while he went to the St. Louis area, and he came back, and I guess I could understand that one. He started out at SIU, didn't do computer science, did electronics. And originally was working on different things for kind of plant industrialization types of things and processing. I won't go into any more details unless you want to.
Oh, that's fine.
But he was using things like PLCs, which I've had to use once or twice before, and did a lot of real-time systems and things, and then gradually decided, you know, there's this electronics and assembling and all this junk. Maybe software would be more fun. So he came back to Springfield, got a master's at UIS in computer science, and started working at LRS doing things in Delphi, which I know a few of you know about, a number of years ago. And since then, he's been a contractor and has been various and sundry places in the area, but has worked primarily as a contractor in lots of different things, and he likes a top-level systems view. Keith, shame on you. He'll get me back. We got to talk today, and then I started yakking, which meant I kept yakking and yakking, but he likes things like domain-driven design, patterns. He likes to do a lot of systems integration, likes to use appropriate tools, and one of the things he cares about is business intelligence in SharePoint and using it from a practical standpoint to help solve problems. So I'd like to welcome Brian and the whole idea of SharePoint yet again. So, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, while we're opening that up, people familiar with SharePoint? Used it at all? A couple people. Okay. Well, what we're going to talk about today, as soon as I can close this, is SharePoint and how it can be used for business intelligence, the tools that come with it. We're going to create business intelligence solutions in SharePoint 2013. My name is Brian Decker, work for Capital Strategies. Email address and Twitter account are there. Sometimes I say interesting things on Twitter, sometimes I don't. But we'll go ahead and get started. Mark gave me a good introduction, but here's some of the things, a little bit of info on me in general. I'm a consultant currently at Capital Strategies. I do a lot of work with application and hardware infrastructures. I've typically worked in project management, team lead, and solution architect roles. I don't always do day-to-day development anymore. I spend a lot of time in Word and things like that, writing up documents, reviewing things, and so on. I also spend a lot of time with a lot of clients that I work for, assisting them in setting up application and hardware infrastructures. Namely, this is one of the last clients I've been at. They had a lot of issues with getting things like Kerberos to work and understanding how distributed computing, getting all the connections made so that everything works together seamlessly for how they're wanting to use the applications, or even SharePoint actually. So I helped them a lot with that. In talking with Mark earlier, I've kind of dated myself a little bit, but I first started developing solutions in 1995 with SQL Server 4.2 and Visual Basic 3. If you remember that, SQL Server 4.2 was right after its port from Sybase. So that was a very long time ago. Stored procedures could only be 64K, I think. If it got any bigger than that, you had to break it up into separate files. They could only be so big. There were a lot of things that if you saw today in SQL Server, you wouldn't even use it. But that's the way it was a long time ago. Windows NT 3.5.1 and so on. So it was interesting back then. I was a field service engineer from 92 to 95. Worked in, mainly traveling around the country, did some work in Mexico and Canada. working in feed mills, setting up automated systems for controlling the process where corn would come out of barges off the rivers, get loaded up into mills, all the way down through batching, feed together and pelleting so that the animals get loaded out into trucks, the animals could get fed. All that's all electronically controlled. Most of those systems anymore nowadays don't have any hand controls or everything. Everything's completely automated and controlled by computer. So that's kind of where I first got my start getting interested in computer technologies, in automation and things like that. And I was also a field service engineer. That was document imaging systems. There's automated feed mill, and of course Mark mentioned the DEC, PDP-11, and TSX. So those were things I hope not to touch again. So there comes a picture. Here's a picture of an old DEC PDP-11 as it might have been with the cards and everything in it. Everything kind of slides in the back there. We used to work on these all the time. And it was one of those wherever you pulled that card out, you didn't know if you were going to get it back in and actually have the system working again afterwards. They were always a bit touchy. Here's what I want to work on now. This phone right here probably has more power than a room full of those PDP-11s. Okay, so let's get into the talk. What we're here to talk about tonight is business intelligence. So you kind of have to ask that question, what is business intelligence? I've learned through the years that people tend to have a variety of things that they want to call that. So I looked up some references. Wikipedia tells us business intelligence is a set of theories, methodologies, and processes, architectures, and technologies that transform raw data into meaningful and useful information. Okay, so business intelligence isn't really an app. It's an aggregation of all the data around the industry that can be put to a useful purpose for people to be able to gather information to help them make business decisions. Webopedia, the term business intelligence represents the tools and systems that play a key role in the strategic planning processes of the corporation. Microsoft, business intelligence simplifies information discovery and analysis, making it possible for decision makers at all levels of an organization to more easily access, understand, analyze, collaborate, and act on information anytime and anywhere. So the theme is aggregation. We're taking information from someplace, business information, taking that information and putting it into a usable form so that the people that need to make the decisions have that knowledge in front of them to be able to make those decisions. We run into this constantly. Success factors for implementation have to have a business sponsor. If that works for any kind of development, it is doubly so for business intelligence. You can't go gather requirements the same way you would necessarily gather them for a regular application. You have to get that information out of the users in a different fashion. How do they make their business decisions? What do they need? It's a little different than, hey, I need a screen that takes this information, I need to be able to save it and report on it later. Okay, you have to figure out how they do their work, how they do their job. And also sufficient business sponsorship manage their executive to act as visionary for the program, have to have that. Sufficient time allocated for validation of data. Most data from a BI system comes from all different kinds of sources. It could be coming from a mainframe. It could be going through some extract process. It could be, we've all done conversions of mainframe data to new systems. A lot of times that data is not how you would really like it to be. A lot of cleansing has to happen. And that takes a lot of time. And it also takes a lot of time to have the users sit down and validate that data. You can't make good business intelligence decisions without valid data. And you don't know if the data is valid until you have the people available to spend the time to validate it. Business needs. I've been in situations where we don't always have, they think business intelligence would be cool. It'd be nice to have this, but there's not necessarily a real business need maybe. You have to have that business need to be able to solve a current business problem and strategic to defined organizational goals. Okay, so your organization has to have a strategic need for the information that you're going to gather and collect. And kind of goes back to sufficient time allocated for validation of data is the amount and quality of the data. Obviously, if I have one little access system or something that doesn't have much in it, I may not garner much use out of building a business intelligence system to be able to view that data. I want to get it from different places within my organization to be able to present it. Okay, now one key thing, and I don't know, does anybody, have you guys worked with data warehouses or anything? Oh, a couple of you? Okay, so you know what some of these terms are. Measures and dimensions, very important. Everything we do with business intelligence is a measure of something and its scope, so to speak. So a measure is a property on which calculations can be made. A measure is a numeric representation of a set of facts that have occurred. Dimensions, a collection of reference information about a measurable event. A context that helps consumers of measures understand the meaning of those measures. So I have my counts, my data, my sales. Okay, but now I have my dimensions like sales in a county, sales in a particular region, sales by category, internet or online, to kind of bring some context to those measures so that they give them some meaning so I know what I'm looking at. So measures and dimensions, very important, can't have business intelligence solutions without them. Business intelligence visualization. Now that we have measures and dimensions, what do we do with this data? We're not really going to talk about analysis services tonight and creating cubes and doing that. That's a good topic for a DBA. Very complicated processes. We're assuming the work has been done to already create these cubes to make this data available to be able to put together. Some of the things that go into business intelligence visualization. Key performance indicators. You've all probably seen the pictures of things where, you know, I've got a red light, a green light, and a yellow light. What's the quick visual representation that I can see, hey, I have a problem, or no, everything is okay? Those are my key performance indicators. These indicators are a quantifiable measurement with specific targets or goals that make the difference between success or failure of a company. That's kind of a broad term, but doesn't necessarily mean success or failure of a company. But these KPIs are what you use in order to determine how well things are going. Have I met my goals? Am I close to not meeting my goals? Have I failed in meeting my goals? Scorecards. Scorecards are a collection of information aligned to an organization's strategic objectives, enabling people in the organization to see how their goals and activities correlate with the company's goals. I take KPIs and I attach them to scorecards. I can see the actual data, and then I can see a measurement of the performance of the particular data that I'm looking at. And then, of course, dashboards is where we pull it all together. And we'll be doing that performance point tonight, creating some dashboards. Display performance at a business unit, team, or individual performance level. And dashboards have an analytic capability to not only view performance to date, but to identify trends that may indicate opportunities or threats in the future. Dashboards are where I pull everything together. Now we'll talk a little bit about business intelligence solutions. I kind of have broken it out into three separate areas. BI data services. I have to get my data from somewhere. This involves, in the Microsoft stack, basically involves SQL Server data services and SQL Server integration services. And I specifically mention integration services because that's a good way to get my data from disparate locations into a warehouse. Maybe I've got those access databases. Maybe I've got those input files from a mainframe, flat files, whatever. I've got this data. I need to have something to be able to take this data, aggregate it together, put it in a warehouse, or put it in some place that a cube can be later created from, or someplace where that data can be, that you can report on it later. Those are the data services that allow us to do that. Business intelligence engines. I'm going to call SQL Server Analysis Services an engine. You create a cube basically by using facts and dimensions, and you create, this cube is created from that warehouse data. So it's kind of an engine that helps correlate that all together and sets it up in such a fashion that I can actually utilize that data differently than I would if it was just sitting in a database. Microsoft Power Pivot for SharePoint is also what I would consider a BI engine. It's kind of a small version of analysis services, I guess, so to speak. And Power Pivot allows you to take data from disparate information and put it in a form that can be used in like Excel without actually having a cube available to you. BI tools, Performance Point, Excel services in Excel, or what I'm going to concentrate on are the main things where you take this data that's in the cube and available and how you visualize it, how you bring it to the forefront, the tools that you can use to actually make some sense out of the data that's been stored for you. So we're going to talk about those tonight as well. So what are we going to cover tonight? We're going to talk about creating a SharePoint 2013 infrastructure, enabling BI in SharePoint 2013. We're going to do a performance point demo and an Excel services demo. Are the majority of the things we're going to cover. First off, creating a SharePoint infrastructure, and I'll go into central administration a little bit and kind of show you what I'm talking about, but we'll go ahead and work through a little bit of the slides. Setting up the SharePoint farm. The demos we'll be seeing tonight are based on the infrastructure I've set up, which is Windows Server 2012, SQL Server 2012 with data services, analysis services, and reporting services. SharePoint 2013 is the what we're going to use tonight. We have it set up as an on-premise hosted application. 2013 version of SharePoint does things a little differently as far as apps and development goes. We've created a hosted web application with an internet site collection and a development site collection. Most of the performance point and Excel services I'll be showing you are on the internet site. You could also do them on a development site and migrate them, but for expediency, I've just created them on the internet site. But I'll also show you the development site that can be set up for you out of the box. We're also going to be talking about enabling BI in SharePoint 2013. What do we need to do to set up performance point? Enabling the performance point features, adding data connection and performance point content apps. We don't need to do this, but set up Kerberos, required for passing user credentials to SQL servers located or computers located in different areas, not on the same server. We don't have to worry about that tonight because all our data is basically located on one server in the farm. So it's a one server farm in essence. Set up unattended account and secured store. Another way to get around the Kerberos issues is that if you use a distinct user account, so if I'm coming into the SharePoint site and I'm going to go grab data, and I'm using performance point, that engine needs to go get its data. Well, do I use my credentials to go get that data from the analysis server, or do I use some credential that I've established as an unattended account to go get that data for me? The latter is easier to set up. If I need to actually use user credentials, that's where Kerberos and other things come into play, and it becomes a lot more difficult in actually setting that up, or a lot more complicated. Excel services setup, set up trusted data connections, set up unattended account in a secure store, and again, Kerberos is one thing that if you're going to, and it's typically something you run into. It's like, well, the app works, or it all works when I'm using SharePoint on my local sandbox, so to speak, because it's just SQL Server analysis services and SharePoint are all running on the same box. Well, now I scale it out to a production environment where I have two SharePoint web front ends. I've got SQL Server running in a cluster, and I've got other app servers running other services that we may need to use. And if I want to pass credentials around, you have to set up Kerberos in order to be able to do that. Okay, so now I want to go in and talk a little bit about the SharePoint setup. Okay, here's SharePoint 2013 Central Administration. Initially the setup of what I did in order to create these two sites, we set up a hosted account, or a hosted application. We'll get this to pull up here. That's this SharePoint HNSC host 80, okay? So if any of you are familiar with multi-tenancy, SharePoint allows you to set up things in a multi-tenant fashion now. So I can create a host and have that host run both my intranet and dev site collections. But those site collections aren't running under server name /sites / the name of the site collection. They're actually individual URLs that I can use. So as you'll see on the developer site, it's dev.deblab1.local. The internet site, intranet.lab1.local. Okay? I could create as many as I wanted, relatively speaking. And those all run underneath this particular web app. It used to be that you could create multiple web apps and each web app would have its own URL. Now I have the ability to do multi-tenant, set this up with multi-tenancy so that each of my site collections can have its own specific URL. One of the things you have to do in order to do that, and SharePoint doesn't always make it intuitively obvious how to set these things up. One thing you do have to do, you can't just use a wizard in order to be able to create those sites. At least I haven't found a way to be able to do it. You have to use PowerShell. So if you're not familiar with PowerShell and you want to do things as far as setting up SharePoint, this is a good tool to learn. I don't know if any of you have become familiar with the integrated environment that's now in PowerShell. Very, very handy. Works very well. Allows you to be able to see all the commands. I can actually use these commands that you see up here. I can click on these and use these commands, type in the data or properties that they require, and I can click insert and it'll actually create the PowerShell string for me to be able to run, the PowerShell command, the commandlet. So what I have here is I have a couple of the scripts I'll go ahead and show you on how we, the first one is the one that actually creates the apps for the dev. I create an app domain. Actually, I did that backwards, excuse me. Since I created the host service, I need to actually create these site collections. So right now, if I ran this script, which I've already done, it will create these specific site collections. It creates a root collection, and my domain name is lab-001.local. So it creates a root site collection there, and also I create the intranet and the dev site collections. And I give them their URL in order to be able to access those. And down here, this script will actually create the app management service and give us the ability to be able to deploy these apps in a dev and an internet environment. So it's the subscription settings, the application pools, and so on that allow us to do that. And it creates the subscription. So you have to run these two scripts in order to create the SharePoint structure that we're using tonight. The HNSC web application and the actual three site collections, the root and then the two that we'll be using. But PowerShell will be your friend if you have to do anything infrastructure-wise with the setup of SharePoint as you're testing these out. And also to note is that SharePoint 2013 cannot run under Windows 7 or Windows 8. It has to actually run on a server environment. At this time, it used to be that with SharePoint 2010, you could actually install it in Windows 7, so you didn't have to have a VM or anything like that running, but you can't do that any longer. Okay, so back to central administration. Now that we have our web application and site collections set up, one of the things that we have to ensure are running in order to do our business intelligence is Excel services as well as performance point services. I'm going to click on performance point. Clicking on those services takes you into a properties or setup that you can use in order to configure these. The performance point service application settings. Here's where, when I go into this for the first time, when I want to set up performance point, here's, if I'm using the unattended service account, here's where I create that user. So, and then I can also give it an application ID. When it creates these in the secure store, I can actually give it an application ID so I can either create the user or I can tell it which application I want to use if I created that unattended account in the secure store earlier. And these are just some various settings to actually use. Then the effective username is something new, and I believe that helps you get around those issues a little bit with Kerberos, but I haven't used it a whole lot. And I know there's, like in the warning, there's a few things that it actually doesn't work with. So in my experience, I've always done it the other way. I haven't really explored the effective user too much, but I know it's in quite a few of these things for Excel services and Performance Point now to be able to use that. I just left all this at the default, all these settings. Trusted data source locations. Right now, I just have it set to the default for all SharePoint locations. I can actually specify specific URLs where I want to actually trust the location for the Performance Point for the dashboards and things like that. And then trusted content locations. Right now, I have that left at all SharePoint. Unless security reasons dictate, I see no reason why you would have to limit that or bring that down to that level. Okay, Excel services, when you're setting that up, most settings are fine. The one that you typically have to use, the trusted file locations, by default it creates everything under HTTP as a trusted location. You could restrict that and set up specific locations where I want to be able to run these Excel services spreadsheets from. Trusted data providers, there's a whole list in here by default. I haven't really had to mess with this too much, just it has everything in it that I think you'll need. Trusted data connection libraries. This is one thing you will have to create. You'll get an error if you try to run Performance Point if you haven't set this up. You have to set the location where the library where you're going to set up your data source locations. If you don't, you'll be able to create parts of it, but you'll get an error when you try to use it where it'll tell you that it's not a trusted data location. So very important, if you run into that, you have to set that up. And I haven't created any user-defined function assemblies or set the data model settings. In essence, that's what you have to do from central administration standpoint. Enable those Performance Point services under the application and site collections, and set the particular settings for Performance Point and Excel services. So now I want to go look at let's go to the intranet site. Now before you can use these Performance Point and so on, there are features that you have to enable on the site level. I've enabled it in central administration. I've set the trusted file locations. I've set up those in order to be able to allow other site collections to be able to use that functionality. But one thing you have to do is we have to I get confused sometimes as to where to look because it's changed. Here's site settings. You have to enable under site collection features for Performance Point, you have to enable the Performance Point service site collections feature. It won't be activated by default. You have to turn that on. As well as under site actions to manage the site features, you have to also turn on Performance Point services site features as well. Both of those have to be on before you can do anything with Performance Point. With Excel, that pretty much just works right out of the box. I don't believe you have to turn anything on with that. Okay, so let's go ahead and do, I've created a couple already, but I want to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and open up Excel services, and we'll go ahead and create a dashboard with Excel services so that you can see how that's done. I've already got a couple out here. Being that it's a demo and you never know when things are going to work right and when not, I've already put them in the site. We'll go ahead and create them by hand first, and then if by chance we would run into a problem, we'll at least have these to be able to go to. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up Excel. I'm going to go ahead and create a blank workbook. I'm going to close this because I don't want to activate it. One of the first things you need to do when you're creating an Excel spreadsheet to use with Excel services, I need a data connection. So I'm going to click on connections and I'm going to go ahead and add one. I have already created one and stored out on the SharePoint site. I'll go ahead and show that to you real quick. If I go to site content, I have a data connections folder out here where I have my data sources that I currently created. You can create a data source in Excel and then export that out of Excel and upload that directly to SharePoint. I like to use the data connections. I like putting them in one location. If you save the data connection, even if I use this data connection, I have the ability to save it in the workbook. To me, the problem with that is now my data connection is in a workbook. If I have 15 of these workbooks and something has to change with my data connection, I now have to go update every one of those workbooks in order to facilitate the change, like maybe it moved to a different server or something like that. So I like creating these this way. I allow to always use the file, and I point Excel towards using this cube. So I'm going to go ahead and add. It's going to ask me, I'm going to browse. Now up here, of course, that takes you to my documents. I can browse. If I can spell. Okay, so I browse directly to that document library, and now I can see my Office 2013 AdventureWorks cube, my data source. So I'm going to go ahead and open that. And you'll see that that now is inside my workbook's connection settings. I'm going to go look at the definition. You'll notice that in the connection file, it's pointing to that location. And I have this set, always use the connection file. If I uncheck that, it's going to save that connection information in the workbook, and it will be in that workbook until I tell it not to be any longer. So this makes it so that I always use that file for my connections. Under authentication settings, remember I talked about the unattended service account? So here you got a couple settings. I can use the authenticated user's account, which would be me. And if I was getting this data for this cube, my credentials would need to be passed all the way back to that data source, all the way back to that cube in order for me to be able to log in. Many times it's easier just not to do that unless there's a security reason why you have to. It's kind of like using a trusted subsystem account. So I've opted to use a stored account. And remember earlier I mentioned the application IDs in central administration. I created an application ID for an Excel Services Unattended account, and I just called it Excel Services Unattended account. I added that as the stored account so we can actually go look that up in SharePoint in order to be able to log on to the server. Okay, so now I have my data source. Now we get to create some data. And I have my notes here, so I can continue to do this. Pull up the create pivot chart. I can actually select the external data source I want to use. The connection in the workbook that I just created, I can go ahead and select that. And I'm going to go ahead and put the pivot chart in the existing worksheet. Okay, so the chart pops up, as you see initially, and then it also pops up this pivot chart fields. Remember we talked about measures and dimensions before. I connected it to an AdventureWorks cube by default. So now it knows that I'm connected to this cube. When I create a pivot chart, it gives me the options of the measures and dimensions that the cube actually makes available to me. Okay, so here's all the measures, have that symbol by them. And down here further, you see there's a lot of them in the cube. Down here further, I get to the dimensions, customer, date, and so on. So things like sales orders, counts, Those types of things are the measures. The dimensions are what gives them context, meaning customers, delivery dates, employees, that type of thing. So initially what we're going to do here is we're going to pull up the sales summary measure, and I'm going to grab the sales amount, and that goes down here into values. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab, going to go down here to dimensions, and I'm going to pick product categories. Okay, so you see what that just did right there? I picked up sales amount and I picked up product categories. So right off the bat, it's showing me my categories are accessories, bikes, clothing, and components, and then here's the dollar values associated with them. So this is going to be our first dashboard. I'm going to go ahead and name this product sales. I'm going to move this over here. Going into format chart area, I'm just going to make it so that this doesn't move when things are resized. Now I'm going to go ahead and save the workbook. Right now I'm just going to save it to my documents, and I'm going to call it Adventure Works Sales 2. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and create another one real quick here. We'll do Insert, Pivot Chart. For each one of these charts, I have to pick the data connection. I'm going to go ahead and put this in there. Same thing. So now what I want to go ahead and do is I want to pick sales summary. I'm going to go pick the measure that's the sales amount. And I'm also going to pick sales territory, which will give me my dimension. I'm going to go ahead and move that over here. I'm going to rename this so we can find it later. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and save this real quick. Now we're going to insert a pivot table. I'm going to also choose an external data source. I'm going to tell it to create the pivot table there. This is a different thing. It's not a chart, it's a pivot table, but it basically functions in the same fashion. But now I'm going to go ahead and pick order count as a measure. I'm going to pick sales summary, sales amount. And then I'm going to go down and find my product categories. Sorry, I did that wrong. Let's pick sales. There we go, sales channel. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and pick enter in another pivot table real quick here. You kind of get the idea on how you have to set these up. Basically what we're doing in Excel right now is we're creating a dashboard. We can do something very similar in Performance Point. I'm going to pick order count again. Now we'll pick product categories. We'll call this order sales. Okay, now that we have that, we can go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. We can create a timeline control. It's going to ask me to pick Datasource. I'm going to pick date for the timeline control. I'm going to go ahead and move it over here. Bring it this way. Report connections. So now what I can do is I can actually attach this timeline control to everything we just created on here. So now what I'm going to do is we can set some browser view options. There's a couple different ways we can do this. In these browser view options, I can say I want to do the entire workbook. I can do sheets, or I can do items in the workbook. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say we want to see the whole sheet. So I'm going to do that, and we're going to save this as I had created a document library when I was working through these called Excel dashboards. I like kind of keeping everything in SharePoint the same thing, so I have a document library for Excel dashboards. We're going to call this Adventure Work Sales 2. You can see here's the other two that I created earlier. Now it says it's uploading to SharePoint. Okay, it's all done. That one's actually in SharePoint right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this, and I am going to go to Site Contents. I'm going to go to Excel Dashboards, and I'm going to click on the one we just created. This is it right here. And this is where Excel Services comes in. It can recalculate all this stuff. It's running through Excel Services in order to be able to do this. And I believe it'll pull it up in the web app for Excel. So basically what we've been able to do is we've been able to create spreadsheets, and I can clean that up. I could have told it to hide the grid lines and do some other things to kind of pretty it up, make it look more like a regular web page. But what we've done is we've created a spreadsheet, we've attached it to Cube Data, and we've published it to SharePoint. So now anybody that has access to those can actually access this way. And we publish the whole sheet. So what I'll go ahead and do is I'm going to show you on this site, I've created a couple of intelligence links here. or what I'm calling them, there's a thing in SharePoint called promoted links. It's actually a very simple way to do this. I can create promoted links and attach them to different things. So when you're building a dashboard, you want to make things easy for people to get to. If that dashboard was something I wanted my users to get to when they got to their main site in SharePoint, I can put them in promoted links. This is one similar to the one we created. I'm going to click on that and then get right to it. So your users don't have to know exactly what document library things are in, and how you structure your site is going to be how they actually get to these spreadsheets and how they're able to use them. And you can see when I click, there's the warning. I needed to go to an earlier year. Let's try 2009, from August to January of 2009. Let's try years, make that a little easier. There's 2007. I don't have data for 2010 in some of these, so it doesn't show it. So the timeline control, if you add these, like timeline filters or slicers to your spreadsheet, you can actually take a look at the data as you're seeing it. So like here, I can open up accessories. Everything's broken down, just like a pivot table would work. And the neat thing is, let's say I wanted to add another dimension to this. I can actually say, let's see, what would be a good one? What about customer geography? That ought to really expand it out. Okay, so bike racks in Australia, New South Wales. Yeah, that wasn't a good one because it doesn't show the data the right way. But you get the point. If you pick the wrong thing, it's obvious. The data won't show up right. Like you just saw there, everything was broken down the same way. Let me try geography this way. Yeah, it's going to do the same thing. Okay, well, you get the general idea. Obviously, you have the whole power of Excel for sorting, clicking on things, looking at the data in different ways. But that's why we do this, is to make it so that the data, a user can actually come in. So you're not really building an application, you're building a tool for a user to be able to use. You're building something for a business user to come in and be able to say, okay, well, I want to look at channel sales, or I want to look at how bike racks are doing. Those kinds of things are things that you can actually see in these spreadsheets. Now if I go back, I have another sheet out here that's AdventureWorks sales items that I want to show you something a little different. You saw that browser view options that I showed earlier. Well, we did the whole sheet, and then this sheet is basically the same thing, except I set the browser view options to each individual chart. So what you'll see is now it's basically the same spreadsheet. All I did was change the browser view option and republish it under a different name, and now I can actually see it a little differently. I'm seeing each individual item. Same data, different items. The timeline is a little different. Instead of months, I can do years just like before. Pick 2007. It's going to requery the data. But that still applies to everything in this list. Okay. Now we're going to go into performance point. Okay, so performance point's just a little bit different. What I'm going to do there is performance point actually has a designer that goes along with it. So what I think I'll do is I can go through and create the performance point thing. What I'll do first is I'll go ahead and show you the performance point dashboard. We'll open the designer and look at something I already have. I can create another one, but you know that'll take a bit of time. So let me go ahead and one of the things about performance point and at SharePoint is you need to add apps. Okay. In order to be able to get this data connections and the performance point content, you actually are apps that you can add or apps from your organization. If you publish an app to an app store for your organization, you can pull out of that app store and add these apps into your SharePoint site collections. And I'll show you that in just a little bit. But basically, when I enabled the features for performance point, when I activated those features, what you'll see is it actually added performance point content and data connections libraries for performance point. These apps weren't available for me to choose until I enabled the features on the site collection. So if you go out to SharePoint and you're looking for performance point and you haven't enabled those features, you won't see these in the site collection until you actually enable those features. You won't see them as apps that you can actually add to your site. So what I did is I went ahead and added these two to the site already. And that's why you see them here. I added them to the site, then they showed up in my lists, libraries, and other apps that are actually on this site right now. These are the things that I can create on this site. So I'm going to go ahead and click this and go into that. Here's the dashboard. Everything that I do with dashboards gets stored in this basic list, this performance point content list. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to open up. There's a performance point tab up here. I can actually open up the dashboard designer. This also doesn't show up until you have that list there. I'm going to go ahead and open up the dashboard designer, which is a click once app that will launch and install on your system. So here's the dashboard designer. You basically have SharePoint and a workspace. Right now it's going to show me what's available in SharePoint. I've selected data connections over here. So what you'll see is this is my data connection that's actually in SharePoint. If I go look, I don't have anything in my workspace yet. My workspace is like my local area that I'm working in. What I can do is if I need to make a change or if I want to open this up, it'll actually go get that. And now if I go look, I see it in my workspace now too, because it doesn't download it until I say, hey, I want to go look at this, and then it takes it and puts it into my workspace. So here's the connection properties. The server that I actually have it running in is right here. Here's the database. Here's the cube. There's a couple of cubes in here. AdventureWorks and Mind Customers. I'm just going to use AdventureWorks. Again, unattended service account. I can tell it to use the unattended service account that I created when I first set up the performance point application service. I could also use a stored account if I went ahead and created one with an application ID, just like I did with Excel services. Or you can use per user identity, which again, if you have to go through multiple servers, it becomes a little bit of a headache to set up. So right now we're just using the unattended service account. And they are problematic to set up sometimes, so it's always handy that they have a test data source button. Yes, my connection was successful. So now, since I have the data connections and contact list, here are the dashboards, the KPI, a scorecard, and an analytic chart that I created earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the KPI, and I'll just kind of explain what everything is, rather than going through the motions of going ahead and creating it again. You notice since I just clicked on the KPI, that's the only one it brought down. That's the only one that's in my workspace. If I were to double click on the dashboard, because the dashboard contains everything, it's going to go ahead and pull everything down. You can see it pulled everything down, and here's my dashboard and so on. So let's go ahead and look at the KPI. Remember I said KPI is a key performance indicator. So here's where I set up what I want my key performance indicators to be. Right now we have a year-to-date value. There's an actual and a target is how this works. And it looks at the data to be able to determine this. So there's a year-to-date and a target. I set up the number format. I can set up the type of indicator that I want to see. For instance, I guess I have to add a new indicator to see that. I thought it would show me. So here's a data mapping for my year-to-date. I have to go tell it what year-to-date is. I pick a measure to be able to use just from our list, just like we did with Excel. So here's a reseller sales amount. And what I need to do is I need to create a time intelligence filter. So what that does is it says year-to-date. If I do a preview, that'll show me what the year-to-date is. And I need to show you something on the data connection that's a little different that can get a little tricky. So this is the actual preview of what the year-to-date time formula would actually do. I'm going to look at something real quick here. We're going to go back to the cube, or back to the data source. This is very important. If I don't set up the time for the connection and performance point, it won't know what my constraints are for the data that I need to go get. You have to set up the time, otherwise it won't, don't believe it'll actually show you anything. So here I have to pick a time dimension. So here we picked for this data source. You have all these options, but we picked date calendar. You choose a date to begin the year from the selected time dimensions. I don't know why that's not set. It must have cleared out when I... Yeah, it must have cleared out. I'll just go pick it again. So here's all the time dimensions. I'm going to pick January 1st of 2006. And the hierarchy level is going to be, I think I want to set that to day. And then, of course, you set a reference date. If you don't set that information, it won't. Let me double check that. Yeah, day. So let's go ahead and back look at the KPI, back to the reseller sales amount, year to date. Here's where I pick the data source. I have to actually pick the data source that's in our library in order to be able to go get the data. No calculated metric on this one. So that's where that's what this means it's going to show me. It's going to show me the year-to-date values from the reseller sales amount. It's going to use that for the KPI. Now, on the target, I basically set up the same thing. I want to compare the target to year-to-date, so that's where I set the compare. I've got my indicator. I can tell it best is 120 or any percentage, threshold 2, 1, and worst. So these are what's going to change the colors. So if my formula calculates a certain way and it's greater than 120% or greater than 100% or it's in 50 or 0%, that's what's going to set the color on my scorecard for that. That works off a custom formula. Basically, that formula are last year's sales. Okay, so my time intelligence filter for last year's sales is year minus 1. I select that. Oops, see, I didn't get that. That should have previewed correctly. Okay. That should be time minus 1. And then the formula that I want to use in order to come to that percentage is last year's sales for my target. I want it last year's sales times 1.25%. So that's what my target's going to be. And then if I'm not within, if my prior year is not within 1.25% of this year, if it's way less than that, if my target is less than that, then that's what'll set those indicators based on where I'm at. If I'm right on it, it'll be green. If I'm 50% below, it'll be 0. If I'm 100% below, it'll be red. So that's what we would expect to see there. So that's the KPI. Now, the scorecard. Yeah, there's an error there. Hold on a second. No, don't save. I'm going to go open that up again. So here's my scorecard. When I created the scorecard, basically I take a measure and a dimension, right? I take a dimension basically, and I put that over here on the left-hand side, and then I take my KPI and put it over on the left-hand side here when I'm creating these, and then I take my dimension and also add it to this column, and this is what I see. So my year-to-date is 340,479 for Australia, the total. My target was quite a bit higher, so you can see I'm down, it's minus 68%. Red. I think some of these, if I go down further, I'll get some other colors, but based on how it's the connection set up, this company is not doing very well. I know one of these is in here. Oh, there's a yellow. I just saw it. Did you see it? There's one. So you can see they were a lot closer to their target than the others. Not the total, but the individual down here will be. Okay, well, you get the general idea. These are where there's no data. And then the dashboard is where I take. What I do with the dashboard is I can take the scorecard. It's where I take the items that I created, the scorecard, the KPI, the scorecard, the analytical charts, whatever I've created, I can take and create this dashboard, this page for this information. So I can grab my performance by country scorecard. Basically what I did is I drug it over here. And then I can take a report. I didn't show you that I created, but it's basically the same thing, which is this analytical chart. Sales by reseller type, and I drug it over to the right. Here's that right here. So basically, Performance Point, you create the individual charts, you create the scorecard, you create the KPIs, and in the dashboard is where you put all this together, create the dashboard, publish it to SharePoint. So here's basically the chart that I used. So my dashboard, I take my scorecard and I take my report and I connect them together. So now when I make a change in what I'm looking at, I'll actually see that change reflected in the report. So like we did with Excel with the filter, when how I changed the dates and it affected every filter or every chart or table that was on that screen, I can actually in Performance Point tie dashboard content together so that when I affect a change in one, it affects a change in the other. And then to publish these, I won't do it because I already got the other one out there. All you have to do is click on Deploy to SharePoint. Actually, that's not what I wanted to do. Designer options is where I actually specify the server. So in here is where I specify the server to actually deploy it to. So when I click on Deploy for that dashboard, it will deploy it in the correct library on the correct server. So now I'm not going to save that. Let's go look at these. We'll come back to home. And reseller performance is my Performance Point dashboard that I created and published. So here you can see our KPIs. The KPI just like we showed in the dashboard. When I click on this, it updates what I actually see. And also, I'm going to do something kind of cool here, which is a decomposition tree. So now I can expand this by business type. So with these decomposition trees, you can do a number of things to actually look at the data in a different way. Performance Point gives you a lot of this stuff right out of the box, and that's why it's nice to be able to use. It's pretty easy to be able to create these things. And really what it's about is empowering the users to be able to go get the information themselves, to give them the tools that they need in order to be able to look at the data that they have or that you've put together for them. You just have to come up with the requirements in order to be able to put it all together. And that's probably one of the hardest things. Creating the dashboards and things in Performance Point's actually pretty easy. Getting what you actually need to show or what you actually need to put on the dashboard is really the difficult part. So that's basically Performance Point and Excel services. Now there's one thing I was kind of experimenting with. I didn't get as far on it as I'd wanted. So here in Visual Studio, and I know you guys have seen some SharePoint apps before. This one doesn't really do a whole lot, but it's more of a concept than it is anything else. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Metro.js JavaScript files. Have you guys used it or anything? It's actually pretty cool. It's a way to be able to give a Metro theme to tiles and so on. So I basically created a SharePoint app to just kind of show a little bit of those tiles, and then I attached them to the dashboards that I already have set up. Ideally, what you do is in these tiles, you would display maybe a KPI in the title, in the actual tile itself, so you can see at a glance a little bit of that information, kind of like a live tile would be, you know, on your Windows 8 phone or your Surface or anything like that. As information comes across, it comes across the live tile. So one way would be to take a piece of KPI, a piece of information that your department keys off of a lot and put it in one spot. You don't want to have to go drill down through all these reports just to find one little thing that they're always looking for. Put that someplace where it's really visible. And tiles are a good place to do that. So this is just a little bit of code here, a real simple application that uses the Metro.js, which if you haven't seen that site, I'd go look at it. It's actually pretty cool to look at. So I will, and that's where the developer site comes in. What I did was, and I don't know if you're familiar, I don't know how much went into the developer sites. This app right here, it was actually set up as, if I go to a new project, I won't open it up again, but under Office and SharePoint, if you install the Office for 2012 developer tools, you get this app for SharePoint 2013. So that's what I did is I created that. You get like three options, hosted, provider hosted, and then I think it's hosted. I'm getting the terminology messed up. And then SharePoint hosted. And what I selected was SharePoint hosted. And one of the big differences there, besides some of the plumbing, is I don't have a web app to run this through right now. So basically what I have in the project is it automatically creates the features and packages, pages, scripts, and so on are all created along with all the files needed in order to be able to deploy those. I don't know if any of you have ever done SharePoint development in like 2007 or earlier. When you went to create these solutions, you had to do all this manually. So it was typically very difficult to get things deployed because you had to, these XML files, like this elements XML right here, you would have had to have coded all that. There wasn't a nice nifty little thing to do it for you. I know in 2007 there was a solution thing that you could use, but I know on some projects we'd worked on, it was easier just to create this yourself. But now I know in 2010 and in 2013 it's even easier. These projects that they have make it very simple to create these apps. And one of the neat things that we have the ability to be able to do is to deploy. Well, when I deploy, I created that dev site. When you first create the project in SharePoint hosted mode, it'll ask you, what site do you want to use for your dev site? So I gave it that site collection that I showed you I created earlier, set up as a development site. And then it's pretty nifty because it allows you to debug and everything. You can run the debugger, it deploys it out to the site. You could step through the code, step through JavaScript or whatever from Visual Studio. And you can do it remotely, and you can do it right on the machine. So that's really, really nice features of SharePoint development now as they've changed. So here's the developer site. When I deploy the app, it gets deployed to right here. So you'll see that shows under apps in testing. So here's my app in testing. And then you'll see these things, and they should start flipping on you here pretty soon. So that's using, well, the next one needs to slide over. There we go. There's all different kinds of options with the JavaScript that you can use to pretty easily create all different kinds of carousel or slide options to go with these. But the one thing that they would be missing would be actually, it'd be nice to have some KPI information on them, or something that as it changes, I'm now showing a KPI in there. And then if it's something I want to see or I'm interested in, I can click on this and drill down further. So this is in my development site. The other thing, if I want to be able to deploy these, so here's my developer site. I've got this out here. I've tested it. I say, yeah, it looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and deploy it. What I can do is over here under Central Administration. It's kind of like the Windows Phone that you can create stores. So I can create an Office store and a SharePoint store, and I create an app catalog basically. So in my app catalog, when you first go into it the first time, it knows it's not created, so it asks you to create a catalog. It asks you what do you want to name it. So you're creating your app catalog, and what this is when you build apps and deploy them, I can add these apps into this app catalog. Oops, I went to the wrong place. I got to go to the app catalog. Okay, so here's my app catalog that I created. It's basically in Central Administration. So here's where you'd see apps for Office, apps for SharePoint. And what I did is I uploaded this app after I was satisfied that I tested it and it seemed to work. Basically, you just choose a file, so I can go browse. Of course, here's my app. I'm going to bin. This is in debug. Of course, we would never do that. We would have it in release before we went to deploy to production, but here we have it in debug mode. And then here's the app that gets created, and all you have to do is select that and open it, and it will turn around and upload that into this app catalog. There we go. And when it did that, I can't see anything there. So now all my apps that I want, that I've built with Visual Studio or whatever that I want to be able to deploy locally, I can load up into this app catalog. And now I can go back to my intranet site. I can say, okay, site content. I want to add an app. Okay, here's all the apps that are available. I don't see one there. Where are the apps from my organization? Here's the one that's in my catalog. Evidently, I've done something wrong here. Oh, I've already added it. I think that's why. I've already added it once, so it's not allowing me to do it again. But if I hadn't added it, I could select it, and then it would be added to my collection. So here on my site, the apps that I currently have installed, I've actually got this. I've actually installed it already. So here's an app that I have from the store there. And you'll see that I actually have it right here, my Metro app, and I didn't give it a nifty icon, so it's just got the ugly X there. But now I can click on that app, and it will take me back to the one that I've now installed on my site, which is kind of nice. If you can create apps this way, you can just put them in the catalog and then add them wherever you want. So now, if I want to go look at this, I got the click event. It's going to go ahead and take me to my dashboard. That's that little bounce effect. See how that closes? There's a lot of nifty stuff in that little tool. Here's the other one. And then, of course, spending launches Excel services. Does anybody have any questions?
I used to do some things that probably predated business intelligence a lot, and that was more scientific visualization and exploratory data analysis, which is something way off the topic we want to do here. One of the things that often happens is you were showing things where you're kind of flipping things and you're showing changes.
Mm-hmm.
Often what would happen is in the type of exploratory data analysis that I was used to is you used to get like multivariate plots. You'd get cubes, or you actually have stacked plots to be able to look at the correlations.
Mm-hmm.
You'd mean center, you'd drill down, you do statistical analysis instead of just simple value plots. And there's latent data in there to do that. In other words, how is the trend happening? How is it changing?
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at correlation, cross-correlation, to start seeing what are your trends as opposed to just visualizing and saying, look at this graph, look at this graph. So,
Sure.
So what you're seeing right now, you're showing something that's more dynamic than a report, but then there's yet another tier in there. And since this is like 25 years ago, I'm sure that there's capabilities to do that. Are there any facilities to go into things like R or SAS or SPSS or things like that? Or are there tools in there to allow you to do that kind of dynamic visualization?
Well, I think that would kind of be up, the data has to be available in the cube. I don't know of a way right now to get into that as much as you've mentioned, but that doesn't mean I can't do it. It just means I don't know exactly how.
Right.
So, and a lot of it has to do with how you set up the cube and what you have available in order to do that analysis on. And like I showed, it's real easy if you don't, and this is why these things aren't really for the faint of heart, for one thing, because if you don't really know the data that you're looking at, the dimensions that work with specific measures, as you saw in the example I so nicely showed you, that it's easy to add dimensions in what you think might make sense, but it doesn't really get you the data or drill down the way you might think. The values don't add up. So it doesn't stop you from making mistakes when you're connecting things together, but if you know the data, you know what the dimensions and measures mean and how they go together, you can create things where you can drill down and get to the information I think you're potentially looking for.
Right. Well, the information I'm talking about is often a precursor for these dashboards. You're doing the exploratory data analysis to find the trends and things to be able to get those latent plots that have value, as opposed to, well, this is pretty and look how it changes.
Yeah, you're looking at more data mining stuff, I think, probably aren't. Is that more of a data mining type of thing?
It's actually a superset of data mining. The big difference is in the size and the database as opposed to finding ways to dynamically do it. That's something that I've got as a vision of business intelligence, and it seems like the tools yet are kind of awfully rough compared to that. And maybe it's just because in terms of the business context, it's different.
Probably, it might be. And there was a company, I don't know if you guys are familiar with ProClarity. There was a company that actually they were purchased by Microsoft a few years ago. And basically, I mean, ProClarity is in essence Excel services. Performance Point was around before ProClarity. They were both, because I know in 2007 we both had both servers set up. There's a Performance Point server and a ProClarity server. And the ProClarity server allowed you to do a lot of drill down type of analysis on things. It was a very robust tool. But then I don't know, I don't know the exact reasons or what really happened to it. I think they were taking over with Performance Point was going to take its place, and then they were really pushing Excel services and pivot tables and Power Pivot and all these things that they had planned in their stack to kind of take that over.
Along the same lines, can I ask a slightly narrower question? If you've got a dashboard set up where you are looking at your key performance indicators for given fiscal years, and then your user wants to find some sort of a correlation in there. In other words, when we see increases in sales in one region in 1 year, does that correlate well with any other type of change in sales data? How far back do you have to go in the construction of that dashboard in order to allow the user to do that? Do you have to start basically back from scratch, or is there an intermediate step that you can just back up to, add a simple function that allows that correlation to be made, and then run the dashboard back forward?
I think that depends on to where you have to start. You may have to go back and do that. Likewise, if it's something that I can just simply add dimensions into my existing data at a particular point, you can do that as well. But that may not be giving you what you want with that.
I think the answer is it depends. It
Yeah,
really depends on what
think
kind
it
of
would.
correlation you want to get.
Because a user can go in and add things to the data or add things to what they're looking at, even if it's already been built. They can go in and modify it, add dimensions, change things, but it still has to be kind of rooted at what the purpose of the pivot table or chart was for to begin with.